Welcome back to week 2 of Masterpieces of the Pre-Modern World. Yes, I did check the name since the last time I talked to you guys. Um, so today we are going to be talking about pre-literate Greece. Um, because the image I have found people tend to have in their head of ancient Greece is Athens, or maybe Sparta, basically. Ever since 300 came out, then Sparta seems to get some play too. But people wearing togas and they're in the big buildings with the columns, and Socrates and Plato are doing their talking at each other, all of that kind of stuff. Um, which is the beginning of literate Greece. There's actually a um, very common argument that I've seen trotted out uh, about 4 different times in my life, actually, um, where basically Socrates said that writing was bad because then people wouldn't remember things. It's the exact same argument that I've seen for why people shouldn't be allowed to use notes on tests and quizzes and things like that, and they shouldn't be able to take open book with it. Anyway, I actually think the argument's bullshit, but Um, we're talking about stuff before that. So for this week, we are very specifically focusing on uh, Homer. Homer. There's some debate in the scholarly world whether or not there was a Homer, um, either a writer or an editor of the Iliad and the Odyssey, or whether it was some other bard slash bards, um, who got a lot of their work compiled. I will be honest, it's a very interesting debate. I'm going to leave that to the classicists. I don't care, because for our purposes, then we're going to say that Homer is the author because we have these two texts that we're working with. We're primarily focusing on the Odyssey. The Odyssey is it's one of the classics. It's literally like the definition of the epic is about the Iliad and the Odyssey, both of which were written by Homer. Iliad comes first. It's about the Trojan War and Achilles um, and his role in the Trojan War. Again, historically, maybe the Trojan War was real. Maybe it wasn't. Right now, we've got enough evidence that we're leaning toward it was, or it was actually a series of wars, possibly. For our purposes, don't give a shit. The text says that they happened, so they happen. And we're reading the Odyssey, which is about Odysseus coming home from the Trojan War. Odysseus being the famous leader who came up with the idea of the Trojan horse so that they could get in and sack Troy, which doesn't actually happen in the Iliad. There are actually at least 7 epics about ancient Greece that we don't have access to anymore. We've seen references to them, um, but just the texts themselves are gone. All we have left are the Iliad and the Odyssey, detailing like that part of Greek history, which kind of sucks. I hate only having like one source for something. That's the sort of thing that just bothers the crap out of me, especially if I know there are other things, but we don't have them. So what are you going to do? Um, and I'm going to be talking about both the Iliad and the Odyssey here. I'm only having you read the Odyssey because I'm sadist, basically. I could have had you read the Iliad and the Odyssey, but for an 8-week course, that's a lot. And I couldn't justify cutting something else out for that. So you get to read the Odyssey. You don't have to read the Iliad, but I'm going to be talking about it anyway because I think it's important to know. These represent um, the ideal that most later epics were striving toward. Gilgamesh was a proto epic. It was a poem that predated this. It didn't have a lot of the form and structure that later became associated with epic literature. Um, Homer is considered to be the ideal of that. There are some definitions of epic that say that's in the style of the Iliad or the Odyssey. I actually think that's a bullshit definition because it is holding up a single thing as an ideal that can't ever be matched. Crock of shit, as far as I'm concerned. Um, a better definition that we can work with would be a an epic poem. Um, First, it is a poem, which means that it it is not necessarily bound by the rules of narrative structure or of traditional grammar or sentence structure and things like that. It's instead bound by its own rules. In this case, they set their own meter, um, and in some cases, rhyme scheme that they're working with. And it's an epic, which means that it transcends um, the the unities that drive a theatrical piece. So it's got a lot of characters covering a large amount of time and a large amount of area. Um, and very particularly, it's going to focus in on a hero being a character who embodies the values of their culture. So if you've got a hero who's doing a lot of cool crap for a really long time, and uh, it's not written as a traditional beginning, middle, end narrative and has some other kind of poetic devices in it, could very well be an epic. It's not an exhaustive definition, but it's enough for our purposes in here. Um, and like I said, the Iliad comes first. It's the story of the Trojan War, which means it is, surprisingly, a wartime epic. And there are three major Greek virtues that are covered in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they don't quite map onto our courage, compassion, and contemplation, um, but there are relationships there. So the two from the Iliad are, sorry, I'm trying to think about how I want to phrase this. The two from the Iliad that gain the most prominence are Kleos and Time in the Greek, which roughly for our purposes are going to translate into honor and glory, which we often think of as being the same thing. But in ancient Greece, then Kleos and Time were actually different. Um, Kleos had to do with, one of them had to do with the stuff you got, the spoils of war that you earned. The other one had to deal with the stories people told about you, which meant that um, they kind of fed into each other. Somebody who was denied some of the stuff would not have quite as many stories associated with them because that means that they were not being honored by their leaders. Um, and basically, the entirety of the Iliad, the undercurrent, is Achilles being a little bitch because he feels like he's not being given the kleos and the time that he is owed, the honor and glory that are owed to him until his best friend dies, and then he just hulks out and kills everyone, commits some atrocities along the way. For our purposes, the more important thing to know, obviously, is going to be about the Odyssey. And the third virtue, the one that shows up in the Odyssey, is Xenia. Uh, Xenophobe is actually the English word that's going to be most closely related to that one that you're likely to have heard anywhere along the way. A Xenos is a person who is an outsider or who is welcoming an outsider. The closest translation that we're going to have is hospitality, would be the closest thing we've got to Xenia. But that's not quite right. Because in Greece, Xenia is not, it's a good thing to help travelers. It is a duty given by the gods. And actually, both sides in this relationship are very tightly bound by some very particular rules of Xenia. So, there are no Airbnbs in ancient Greece, obviously. The idea of the inn or the tavern or the public house comes significantly later in world history. So if somebody is traveling to a new area, then they would go to somebody who is roughly of their societal level. So kings would go visit the kings. Workers would just go into the town somewhere near the marketplace, maybe. Beggars would go to the edges of town and see if there was somebody they could stay with, like a farmer or something like that. And the role of the host in Xenia is to take care of the physical needs of their guests before anything else. Somebody walks into your house, you give them a bath, you give them some food, you let them rest, and only then, only after those things have been done, Can you say, hey, who are you? What's your name? The guests have similar expectations placed upon them. The role of the guest is to not take advantage of the host Xenia, to not do anything to disrupt their life unnecessarily. Don't hurt them, don't take their stuff, nothing like that. Uh, there's actually a lot of Greek writing from the Athenian period that is dedicated to what happens whenever somebody breaks the rules of Xenia. Either they're a bad host or a bad guest. They break those rules of hospitality. Um, and spoiler alert, Zeus hits them with a lightning bolt a lot of the time, either literally or something very akin to that. In any case, their life goes to hell. Um, and that is what the Odyssey is. It's a story of homecoming in which we get to learn all of the Greek rules of Xenia. Now, we're not reading the entire Odyssey. Our book doesn't have the entire Odyssey in it. It doesn't have space. It could not call itself the shorter edition and have the entirety of the Odyssey in there. It's 24 chapters long, and they are not particularly short chapters. Reading them aloud takes between an hour and an hour and a half in modern English, and took between an hour and a half and 2 hours in ancient Greek, we think. Um, we don't know exactly what their cadence would have been, but that's more or less what the scholars have pieced together. We're not doing the whole thing. We're only doing little bits and pieces of it. We're going to see little bits and pieces of Xenia coming through. We're going to see people who are hosting Odysseus and people that Odysseus is hosting all the time. And it's very interesting to look at. Um, the Iliad is a story of courage. Kleos and Time are very closely related to courage. We see characters who are stepping up to defend their homes, their honor, their glory, themselves, their spouses, all sorts of stuff. Um, the Odyssey is a story of compassion and contemplation. What happens whenever people are breaking these rules, and how is it that we are going to go about getting revenge on them? And it's very fascinating. Um, if you haven't read the entire Odyssey after this class is over, if you find yourself with some extra time, I would recommend reading it, honestly, or listening to the audiobook version. Um, because we get to learn a lot from Odysseus. Odysseus is wily. He's a trickster. Um, he's an extremely clever character. He's the model of contemplation. Um, Before, that was the prime virtue of ancient Greece, back whenever courage still had a pretty good lead on it. Um, then he was still a contemplative character, and we get to see a lot of that in our reading. Um, Odysseus tricking the suitors, making the battle plans with the suitors, managing to get back into his own house because of the suitors. We get to see how he functions as a guest in places where he is given great Xenia and absolutely terrible Xenia. We see him working his way out of situations with characters who are significantly stronger than him. It's just chef's kiss. Um, Top of the charts there. So that's kind of the background information that you're going to need to know in order to make sense of this one. Like I said, our book skips around a lot. It does give some summaries of the things that happens in between. They're not very good. Um, if you want to go through and read the Spark Notes for the bits that we missed, I'm not going to judge you for that at all. Um, for our assignments, then we are focusing on the parts that are in the book, but just that extra context can help quite a bit to make sense of it, because there's a lot that happens. Um, so that's going to be more or less what we're doing this week. We're just focused on the one text again, just like we were last week. We're going to start branching out into multiple texts, starting, I think, next week, relatively soon, anyway. But for this week, it's just the one. It's a little bit longer one, so have fun with it. As always, reach out if you have any questions, throw stuff up in the discussion board. That's what it's there for.